Hi, folks. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to help you understand what's going on, some context in the war in Ukraine. Each week on Monday morning, I have been doing a recap. And so if you want to see what happened last week, just roll the clock back 1 week and watch that video, and the same thing with the week before. I do a recap of the headlines that I have sifted through over the course of the week. Now, some of them I talk about in videos, and some of them just didn't make the cut because I had to prioritize things. But I find that a recap will give you a fuller understanding of what has gone on. So we're going back to Monday, November 27th. U.S. Senate announces a vote on Ukraine aid request. Okay, they're about to vote, but they haven't done it yet, and time's getting urgent to the point that the Director of Office of Management Budget today it was reported that they had sent a letter to the top leaders in the House and the Senate saying, look, time's of the essence. You're about to kneecap, this is my words, they're about to kneecap Ukraine if you're not careful. Okay, next article. Having lost Avdiivka, Ukraine will lose all of Donbass, says Pravda. But a week later, Ukraine is still in Avdiivka. They haven't lost it, but that's the way that Pravda and RT and TASS tend to write their articles. Storm of the century kills 4, cuts powers to millions in Russia and occupied Ukraine. It was a bad storm this time last week, and it's just maybe a foretaste of what's coming down the pike. Why pairing border security with aid for Ukraine makes a deal with Republicans so tough. Okay. Now, I'm going to look at this probably different than some other people just because of where I sit. Where you stand depends on where you sit, right? I'm a Republican, and looking at it, I'm thinking like, hey, I would prefer that first that you just give the aid. If you're going to fight about it, pair it with Israel because that way you'll have the most traction. Okay, so you paired it with the border security. Now, it's not just, and I wish that they didn't, but now Democrats work on the border security issue that Republicans have been squawking about for however long. I mean, it's clearly been a big issue to Republicans to secure the border. Work with them and get the thing out. Politics is all about making a deal. Make deals, get this done. You don't have to have it perfect, just keep it moving forward. Okay. So next, Ukraine will join NATO after the war. Stoltenberg says estimates of 1,000 Russian daily casualties are plausible, says the United Kingdom. Yes, that's right. They're at about, some days they're over 1,000. It was like 930 or 960 as an average over November. It was crazy the amount of casualties that Russia was willing to incur, but they just kept coming in Avdiivka. Okay, Ukraine to develop a necessary system to combat corruption, the EU Commission Vice President says, and they are working on that. They're working on putting in all the checks and the levers and all the safeguards necessary to join the EU. And that fighting corruption is important to joining the EU, tells you about where Ukraine was, where Russia is, and where the EU is in contrast. Okay, Putin assigns a Russian national budget for the next 3 years, bolstering military spending. Yeah, military spending is going to go up to about 30%, 40% if you include all military and security. Yeah, they're not going away anytime soon, and we'd be foolish to think that, well, Putin's about to give up. I mean, how long can he go on anyway? No, know your enemy. Okay, Budanov's wife is poisoned and hospitalized. This is Tuesday, November 23rd. I did a video about that. Yeah, it looks like somebody got to her. Now, the question is, how did they get to her? And it wasn't just her. There were others within the area. So there's somebody poisoning high-ranking, like the equivalent of our CIA or Britain's MI6, in a reasonably secure location has been able to poison them. That's pretty crazy. She's recovering. She didn't die, but wow. Finland's closing its entire border with Russia because Russia's creating a migrant crisis on the Finnish border, and they know what they're doing with that. And it's not Russians trying to get over, it's immigrants from other places, but they're pushing them to that Finnish border in order to create that crisis. Why Senate Dems are prepared to swallow a border policy compromise. Well, again, compromise is the name of the game. Get something done, work this out, but do it soon. Wednesday, 29 November, Russian general blown up on a landmine, a report says. This was in Euromaidan Press. But it looks like what we know a little bit later was that that was a cover story, that it was blown up on a landmine because that was palatable. But maybe he was actually targeted and hit with artillery. Russian invaders vandalize and plunder the remembrance of a Holodomor in occupied Ukraine. So a Holodomor grave site memorial was being vandalized. 1 million ammunition promised by EU for Ukraine will definitely be delivered, but it hasn't been. Like, at least to date, it hasn't been, and it was supposed to be there, and they really need it. And, I mean, Ukraine's partners are just letting them down in a number of ways. Only 5% polled of Ukrainians oppose Ukraine's accession to the EU. NATO, more than half oppose accession, only within government-controlled territories. That means that you just keep what you have and do that, rather than, and just like split off the regions that Russia took. So the Ukrainians don't want to do that. Foreigners entering Russia could be forced to sign a loyalty pledge. Okay, at what point are you so nervous, so worried about your own, how bad things are for you, that you force every visitor to sign a loyalty pledge? Like, can't say war, or I'm being a little facetious. Yeah, to have to say special military operation if you are a foreigner. I don't know that that's part of it, but you can't go against anything that the state has recently cracked down on. Remember, they're becoming more authoritarian as the days go on. And you're thinking about having foreigners have to sign a loyalty pledge to Russia. Well, Russia is ramping up attacks on Donetsk. That's nothing new. Map is showing the states that benefit from Ukraine aid. So there is this map, and I think this is a little bit of a wrong-headed approach economically, because if you're giving money or giving, signing off on the support, it's costing you. You can't turn around and then say, see, but we're benefiting because the money's going, 724 million is going to California, and $1 billion is going to Pennsylvania, and another $1 billion to Michigan. And right, you can't, it doesn't work like that. It is a cost. Now, it's not as bad as just giving it and writing it completely off, but it's not really fair economically to just say, well, but see, look, we're benefiting. Yeah, if I take $1 out of this, if I take $1 in change out of my right pocket and I put 35 cents in my left pocket has benefited, but it's not really, I haven't really gained as much as I haven't lost as much. I hope that makes sense economically. Where the Republican presidential candidates stand on Israel, Ukraine, and China. An NPR article was showing who's where. Nothing really changed. Haley is really the leading Republican figure that supports Ukraine. Is the OSCE meeting in Skopje, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, that's in Macedonia, a triumph for Russia? Well, it looks like it's starting to become that. Here's Thursday, November 30th. This may just be the beginning. The guards of Finland closed the Russian border completely. So they were closing all but one border exit before this, and now they're closing the border completely, at least for a period of time, so that Russia can't continue to create this crisis. Truck chaos on the Polish border signals tensions over integrating Ukraine into the EU. So the truckers that are there, I understand, are actually truckers from the party in Poland that is most attached to Russia. And so there's some nuance here that if you understand, it makes more sense, right? It's not just Polish truckers writ large, it's truckers from this party are making this political point and trying to impede Ukraine from getting their grain out. Now, why the Polish government isn't cracking down on these truckers and doing more to move them, I don't understand, but that's what's going on there. Okay, where did the U.S. strategists go wrong when they started a proxy war with Russia? An article in Pravda that I took apart this week in one of my videos. The assumptions there were just amazingly bad, that the U.S. started this war with Russia. No. OSCE summit opens amid boycotts, and there were boycotts, and some countries decided if Russia's going, we're not. Most of the Baltics, Poland, generally the countries that are closest to Russia were like, you know what, we don't want any part of Russia being here. We're not going to be part of it if they are. Russia's worst month. November troop losses are comparable to World War I. They really are. The troop losses were horrific. I think that if you look at this, you've got to wonder, like, why is Russia so intent on Avdiivka? And the only thing that keeps coming up is that Putin wants to get reelected, and reelected without. Now he's going to get reelected one way or another, but he wants it to look like he's actually getting reelected because people think he's dreamy, and the way that he does that is he shows some victory, and it's going to be a very Pyrrhic victory. It's going to cost him quite a bit, but he wants that victory of Avdiivka. And so they had the highest casualty rates since the war began in this past month in Russia. Now, of course, they're not going to frame it that way. So they lost about 1,000, little less than 1,000 a day for the last month. So roughly 25 to 30,000, and they have lost upwards of 121,000 over the last 6 months. Not to be outdone, Sergei Shoigu came out and said that, and I'm quoting now, in 6 months of the so-called counteroffensive, the enemy has lost over 125,000 people, Shoigu said. Now, that he feels that he needs to top that is a really odd thing to me, but okay. And there was quite a bit of loss in the beginning of the offensive. If you roll back the clock, we're talking back into June and July. It wasn't going well for the Ukrainians. But yeah, something about those figures seems odd to me. Okay, next article. SBU blows up the tunnel connecting Russia and Chinese railways. It's just above Mongolia. It's the only tunnel really connecting for cargo for military kind of purposes in that region. And they blew it up. They sabotaged it where the train went under, and it blew up like cars that held gas and diesel and that kind of fuel. So it made a very big bang. It really was going to be a crazy bad explosion. And it was bad, and the Russians were very upset about that. They chose a different railway to, and this is what we find out the next day, that they choose a different railway as a backup line, and they go over a bridge, and the Ukrainians were expecting that, and that blew up as well. So it's quite a the Ukrainians had a very good plan, and then plan to with the next step of the plan in place. And the Russians were crying terrorism, but it's really not terrorism when the state that's at war with you is blowing up the way that you transport military goods into your system. I mean, it just, that's not terrorism. Terrorism is targeting a building that people live in, a playground where children play. It's those kind of things, and that's what Russia's been doing and doing and doing and doing. So when they cry terrorism, it's like the boy that cried wolf. Okay, Friday, December 1st, 2023, Russia's defense minister announces Ukraine's losses in 6 months. That's where I was talking about the 125,000. Ukraine war, Putin to boost Russian troop numbers by 15%. So that's interesting. So it's going to go up next year by 15%. That's 170,000 soldiers. But Ukraine took 121,000 off the battlefield in just the last 6 months. So I'm not sure that this is any great victory for them to add these extra 170,000. Zelensky says change is needed in Ukraine's mobilization system as Putin signs a decree on troop increase. Okay, so the Ukrainians are thinking about how to generate more power out of their military by mobilizing people that maybe aren't going to the front but are being used for whatever their skills are. Let's think in terms of like a computer hacking kind of skill, or a welder, or things along these lines. People that have these skills that they can deploy in a smarter way. They really do have a manpower disadvantage compared to the Russians, just demographically, so they have to be smarter about it. Sergei Lavrov says that Joseph Borrell and Anthony Blinken are cowards. This goes back to the OSCE meeting. They won't meet with him. Why won't they meet with me? Well, they're cowards. Well, no, it's because you're doing bad things, and until you to stop doing those bad things and come around, you need to be punished for doing the bad things. And it doesn't. We're not going to give you the veneer of that you're still a diplomat, a legitimate diplomat who's doing legitimate diplomatic things while your country is engaging in these terrorist activities. Okay, Russia fails to get elected in UN ship agency's governing council. So Russia is still trying to use all diplomatic political means in order to wage war. They're waging a war, they're waging an economic war, they're waging a political war, they're waging an informational war, one on top of the other. Zelensky says that we want all countries of the world to support an international coalition for the return of Ukrainian children deported to Russia. That's a great thing to be doing. That's a great thing for her to be championing. And so that's good. It's good all the way around. And Russia has stolen uh, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Ukrainian children. Okay, Russia's federal, going back to the train story, Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB, has arrested a man with a dual Russian-Italian citizenship for conducting sabotage operations. That attack paralyzed, quote, the only serious railroad connection between Russia and China used by Moscow for military purposes. I don't know if he's the right guy or if he's just a sacrificial lamb or what, but they have arrested someone. Ukraine's ex-president says he was blocked from leaving the country. That was an interesting story. So Poroshenko is the former president, and he's looked like he's done a pretty good job being out and being part of the solution and working with the Ukrainian government trying to, wage the war against Russia. He was going, it looked like, to meet Orban, and they didn't let him out. I guess they don't want a bad look or a talking point for Russia about Poroshenko and Orban meeting. He is the opposition leader, or an opposition leader, because Zelensky displaced him and he's in a different political camp. So it could look bad politically. In fact, this blocking him looks bad politically, but it could look worse if he was meeting. So I'm just speculating about what's going on here. Saturday, 2nd of November, partisans destroy a fuel tanker and several Russian invaders in Melitopol, and that's going to keep coming and coming and coming. They're going to keep doing that. Another article, Zelensky says that after presidential elections in Russia, the game is to be on the side of Western leaders of whether to recognize Putin's legitimacy or not. Will they recognize that it was a free and fair election, or not a free and fair election, rather, or will they just go on with life as it is? Nobody doubts that Putin's going to get reelected. And if nobody doubts that he's going to get reelected, there's probably something a little fishy about it. Defense forces liquidate 1,070 invaders over the day, totaling enemy losses to exceed 331,000 servicemen, says the general staff. Okay, Russia's new exploding drone piggybacks on Ukraine's 4G cellular network. One of the reasons that you have to be careful not to assume that your enemy is stupid is because he isn't necessarily. And this is one of the occasions where you can see that the Russians are thinking through things. They're using these 4G cell towers within Ukraine in order to guide this drone. It's actually pretty smart, and the Ukrainians are probably going to figure out how to reverse engineer and do it too. But you don't want to just assume that your enemy is stupid. Germany is Ukraine's new best friend. What difference a war makes? And there's a quote from this. Now, Germany has been picking up the pace. At first, it was Boris Johnson in Ukraine, on the ground in Kyiv. And then you saw Biden kind of get with it and really pick up the pace and start to lead the process. But as the West has faltered in many ways, Germany has picked up the pace, where Germany was one of the laggards early on. Quote, Schultz's leadership is a bright spot in a gloomy landscape. His fears about wider dangers inherent in a Russian victory, while broadly shared, do not appear daunting enough to spur fellow EU and NATO members into more urgent, substantive action. Okay, and that's right. I mean, come on, EU, come on, NATO, let's go. Let's pick up the pace here. Okay, Ukraine predicted where Russia would reroute trains after it blasted the railroad connecting Russia and China. I already talked about that, and that came out in this report on Saturday. Sunday, 3 December 2023. Ships face Houthi-claimed attack in Red Sea as officials say that a U.S. warship also fires in self-defense. That means that the U.S. ship was attacked. Now, that's a terrible scenario, and the reason it's terrible, not just because of U.S. involvement in the Middle East, but because that involvement would take if the U.S. gets drawn in a military way into what's going on in Israel and Gaza, that is taking its eye off the ball significantly in what's going on in Ukraine, and we don't want that to happen. Ukraine says the apparent shooting of surrendering soldiers a war crime. Yep, it looks like what happened was that some Ukrainians, out of ammunition or whatever, they come out, they surrender, they lie down, and they're cold-bloodedly murdered by the Russians. That is a war crime, and it just adds to an extensive list of war crimes. Next article, Army is not slavery. Ukrainian soldiers' wives want them home, others to get mobilized. And so there's a few dozen Army wives that are protesting and saying that you can't keep our husbands here forever. The Army is not slavery. And so this was Ukrainian women protesting that they want their husbands back. I get that. They're doing the same thing in Russia. The difference is in Russia, they were buying them off by having these Putin paying these wives not to protest. Ron Johnson, he's a senator from Wisconsin, says that Russia-Ukraine war will end in a negotiated settlement. Okay, now it's odd that he's taking this position, which Wisconsin's a kind of a purple state. It tends to lean more blue than red. That's more Democrat than conservative or Republican. So you would think, would be a little bit more hawkish, if he was reading what his state sentiment is. Okay, quote, he has nothing but sympathy for the people of Ukraine and nothing but contempt for Russian President Vladimir Putin. But he says he thinks that, quote, Putin is not going to lose this war, unquote. This war has to end, Johnson said in the interview. We're not going to like the result, but every day that goes by, we're going to like the result less. If you could craft a talking point from the Russian side that would be more like that would be most likely to be generated by a bot farm in St. Petersburg, it's that. I mean, that's terrible. Well, I'm not for the war, but we've got to end it sometime, and it's going to get worse. Okay. On the other hand of that, there's Republican John Bolton, who worked for Trump, who is arguing that the U.S. must, quote, act quickly, unquote, on additional Ukraine aid, or Russia will win. Here's a quote from the article. I think we've got to be very concerned about a Russian diplomatic offensive that tries to win over at the bargaining table what the Russian troops can't win on the battlefield. So there's two very different views here, and I'm with Bolton. Bolton is a hawk's hawk, and he's exactly right about that. Okay. That's it for this week's review of what has happened in Ukraine. I hope that helps inform you and give you a sense of what's really gone on over the past week. If you like this, let me know. If you have comments about it, put them below. And thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and the coffees. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.